So this is like totally cool. So this started in November of 2016 in Cuba with incidents, and you're involved with 18 injured Canadians who have had the courage to come forward to pursue litigation against the Canadian government for acts of, what would you call it?
Negligence. It's pure negligence by the Canadian government, not providing the proper safeguards, the warning. They actually told one of our clients, the first one to find out about what was going on from an American. Our client on April 10th speaks with an American. They can't speak inside the living quarters because it's known within Havana, the diplomats' quarters are bugged. Like, it's just well known.
Right.
So they go for a walk. This guy from Texas describes an attack, describes symptoms, and he says, we're getting out. So our guy goes to the embassy the next day, speaks to the ambassador and a couple other people. And
the Canadian embassy.
Yeah, tells the ambassador exactly what he was told. Now, my client is there with his wife and 2 kids.
Yeah.
I think they were probably 14 and 11 at the time. And the ambassador says, you are not to tell anyone what you just told me. You're not to tell your family. You're not to tell anyone in the embassy.
Wow.
And he's a good soldier, so he's not going to tell.
So just frame this for everybody, for our viewers who are not used to it. So this is Paul Miller, who's a senior managing partner at Howie Sachs and Henry, and it's a leading prestigious personal injury firm. But you handle cases that are not. You handle serious,
I'm
big
I'm
cases.
out of the box.
You're an out of the box guy.
I'm out of the box.
And these are serious cases, and this is like an international intrigue. Okay, so I can't swear.
No, you can swear. I got to tell
So
you.
my wife and
my wife.
and Karen, your
Yeah,
wife
my
is
wife.
here, and one of them is saying to me, "Don't swear."
No, we swear all the
so I'm
time
not
over
gonna
this
swear.
case. Over this case, we swear all the time.
But this is incredible. So
can
I really need you to frame what happened and the litigation, because this is something people never really hear about, and it's amazing.
Yeah, so we got contacted in early 2018, and it came through our general intake.
Like a Google intake?
Yeah, and what?
Personal injury lawyer,
Well,
foreign entity f***ing me over. Okay.
and it goes to one of my partners who is a fantastic litigator, but he does catastrophic motor vehicle, things like that. And he says, all right, let me send it over to Paul. So I'm reading this, and it sounds a little familiar, and I Google it. It's like, geez, this is intriguing.
Yeah.
And so, but to sue the Canadian government, it's a different beast. Okay.
But I remember the story that there was an issue about Americans who were in Cuba who were allegedly subjected to some hearing issues through some alleged signal that was like some sort of attack on them.
Yeah, so the Americans, the first attacks were in November of 2016, where, as I've come to learn in the last few days, they systematically picked off people in order of their importance in the American embassy. Mostly people within the intelligence community.
And what do you know that you can talk about right now? Because I know it's in litigation. Mm-hmm. But what were the Cuban authorities doing? What were they using to attack?
It wasn't the Cubans.
It was the Russians.
We believe it was the Russians, but with Cuban aid,
Of course.
because there was only one way the Russians would know where the diplomats live and who was who.
Right.
Because the Cubans keep very close lookout on whoever's there.
Absolutely.
After years of going through a variety of ideas, the most credible information that's out there right now is that it was a microwave pulse device that would shoot microwave strength. I don't even know how to describe it, but it would be aimed at their heads, and suddenly, you can't see it. You start hearing this high-pitched grinding sound. Your head starts pounding. Nosebleeds at times. You get dizzy, and the pressure in the room just becomes unbearable. If you can get out of the room, it goes away. If you open the doors, it goes away. So no one knows what this is. It's been thought that it could have been an LRAD, which police have all the time, and to disperse crowds. And so this happened to American after American after American. And then it started to hit the Canadians in June of 2017. So the guy from Texas who spoke to my client was the first to get hit.
Wow.
Now, I don't know exactly what my client's role was in Cuba. My guess is that he was not on the diplomatic side. He was probably intelligence.
Right.
Because he was
So f***ing cool, guys. Okay, go ahead.
Because he was described as an IT specialist. So we figure, okay, he's not an IT specialist. And then the next person that gets hit is like third up in the embassy. And she is clearly working with intelligence.
So over a period of many months, this was a repeated attack.
And it didn't, the problem that is really significant is that, okay, diplomats sign up for all types of shit. Okay, they know what they're getting into.
Yeah.
But we're talking about the spouses and the kids now. His 2 kids got hit. His 2 kids had nosebleeds for weeks and weeks, and headaches, cognitive issues.
Talk about that a bit. What was the medical sort of outflow of this?
So these folks get sent to Miami, and they see a doctor by the name of Brian Hoffer. And Brian Hoffer is at the University of Miami, and he has been seeing all the Americans, and he does all these tests, and on the Americans and my clients, he concludes that somehow these guys have the symptoms of a mild traumatic brain injury.
Oh wow!
With no actual physical hit to the head.
Because normally you'd have that from a blunt trauma to the head.
Or even a whiplash action, right?
Okay, like in a car accident.
Right. Yeah. Anytime your brain's going to move around, it's going to hit the sides of your skull, and you get a concussion. But there's nothing like that. There's no entry wound. There's no exit wound. But everything...
And there's no precipitating event that they can identify.
No, nothing. And now, interestingly enough, our clients never finish their examinations with Brian Hoffer. Because the Canadian government called up and said, send them out, send them home, national security, we don't want you seeing them.
Okay.
Hold on.
Pause on that one.
Hold on.
Explain that one.
We can't.
Oh, please.
We can't. Except that...
Please tell me Trudeau was in government at that time.
He was.
Oh.
And
Hi, Justin.
And we'll get back to him because it goes back to Pierre Elliott.
Uh-huh.
That's subtle. The doctor tells our clients, the Canadian government asked me to change the medical report.
Holy
does not.
How does that happen?
Well, the U.S. government asked Hoffer to change it as well. They didn't want mild traumatic brain injury being set out there. So these folks end up coming back to Canada, and they're just, the kids are still so messed up.
I'm still stuck on changing the...
Yeah, it's politics. See, the Canadian government, this is our theory, and it's just a theory so far.
Okay, so disclaimer, it's a theory. Don't sue us on this. It's a theory, but it's a good one.
It's a theory. So why is Canada... Canada is involved because part of the Five Eyes. So
what's a Five Eyes?
Five Eyes are the 5 countries that share intelligence, which I believe is United States, Canada, UK, Australia, and I'm missing one.
New Zealand?
New Zealand. That's Five Eyes. Cuba wants the Canadians and Americans out of there. They just do. Because the Russians want the Americans out of there.
Of course.
Because they want to reestablish their Cold War intelligence community. So, after talking to some Americans who have a different perspective, they believe that the relationship with Canada and Cuba is quite different because Pierre Elliott Trudeau maintained normalized relations.
Yeah.
And Justin, for some reason, believes it's his obligation to maintain that legacy. We
certainly don't have the same political posture towards Cuba as the United States.
We have no posture. This American who I spoke to said the Canadian embassy could be bombed and Justin would have dinner with the Cuban government.
Oh, wow. That's a shocker.
And
I'm so never becoming a judge in this country.
Now
I don't want to be. It would never happen.
So I can tell you, and I mean, it gets worse because
Talk,
so
baby, talk.
We have
This is so interesting.
We have 3 clients that get invited down to the University of Pennsylvania, which has one of the preeminent brain injury clinics in the United States.
Yeah.
And they are examining all the Americans. In Canada, these 3 people get brought down to UPenn free of charge because they want
I wish
they want a broader cohort to examine.
Right.
Same injuries. Midway through, the Canadian government gets in touch with the University of Pennsylvania through the State Department and says, send the Canadians home. Now, we get differing stories. The Americans tell me that the U.S. government and the diplomats want the Canadians out. Why? Because the Canadian government had agreed to do an investigation with Cuba as to what was going on. And Canada would share all this evidence with Cuba. And the Americans were like,
They felt they're complicit with Cuba.
Yeah, you.
And they're covering up what was essentially an attack. Fostered by Russia.
Arguably an act of war. Because
fostered by Russia, facilitated by Cuba.
Yeah.
And the Canadian government now wants to cooperate with the enemy.
Right.
Well, if we don't get some more views on this one...
And, well, I can tell you...
This is great.
After this case
Paul,
started...
You're so coming back.
After this case started, my co-counsel on this case, John Phillips, brilliant lawyer, he acted for Omar Khadr. Okay, so he's one of these lawyers who believes in the rule of law, the charter. Whether you like Khadr or not, he believed he had certain rights.
Right.
Okay? And John... because of his experience with that case and acting for CSIS agents, just said to me, you're going to be followed. Wipe your phone if you're crossing the border. He had me so scared. When I would walk the dogs at night, I would see a unmarked minivan in my area. I would start to panic.
So have you restricted your vacation destinations?
Yeah, we go to Florida.
Okay. I suggest Cancun and the hotel zone.
So can I tell you that we were talking about a firm retreat and someone suggested Cuba. I said I'm not going to Cuba. And they said, one of the partners said, why? I said, really?
Seriously?
I said, no, I'm not going to Cuba. But it's fascinating because the Canadian government has, and I've learned so much about how politicians now talk to the reporters.
Right.
Every opportunity is the health and safety of the Canadian diplomats is of utmost importance. Well, it's the biggest bunch of that I've ever heard. So what happens in Canada is that Dalhousie gets a grant from the Canadian government, the medical school, to do an epidemiological study of the Cuban diplomats. They think they're going there for testing and diagnoses.
Right.
And I said to them, you're not. You're going there so they can control the narrative.
Right.
So Dalhousie, after doing all the testing, and we've seen the test results, comes out, Dr. Alon Friedman says in a report that it's pesticides. Now, see, here's the problem with that theory, though. There's a couple problems with that theory. One, how did the pesticide...
Max, are you liking this episode, motherfucker? Okay? I told you it'd be a good one. Okay? There's a lot more here.
How did the pesticides know to get the American diplomats and the intelligence officers of the United States and Canada?
The pesticides were very selective.
And they said, well...
They're intelligent pesticides.
Right, it was to attack the Zika virus. Okay? It didn't fly. Secondly...
Jesus
So
Christ.
the day we got the report, I'm watching CNN. I was watching Chris Cuomo that night. And on the ticker...
I used to like Chris.
Yeah, I still like Chris.
I don't. He's on some
Newsmatch
thing.
or something.
Yeah, I don't know what.
So
it is.
on the ticker, it says Canadian government releases Dalhousie report on Havana syndrome. Well, I've seen the report. For some reason, I decided to go to their website. I have no idea. I pull up the report. It's a different report than the one that they gave us. So we go next day. We gather as a
Unbelievable.
co-counsel group. We go through it. It's different. And so we call up.
I almost want to work for your law firm.
We call up Barney Brucker, who's the Department of Justice lawyer, and I dealt with Barney on another case. And good lawyer, honest lawyer. Like I have no issue with. Yeah, he is a lawyer's lawyer, if you know what I mean. Like
I got it.
Okay, and he says, "Can you send me the reports?" Sure. And he's like, basically, you could just hear him say, "Oh, fuck, what the fuck?" There's no explanation. There's no explanation except one of the reports really doesn't help. Because again, we don't care if it's pesticides. We don't care if it's a weapon. You didn't protect your government employees.
Right, but pesticides are one thing.
But if you know they're going to be spraying this, you got to tell your people, this is what's happening. You're the diplomats. Now, one of the keys you got to remember about this whole case.
And the government, I know I'm naive about this, but our government hasn't, aside from denying this, there's not been an inkling that you've ever gotten about, well, we're upset about what happened to our people.
Not really. Not really. I mean, Minister Jolie...
We'd like to address this with Cuba and Russia.
No, never anything like that.
This is ridiculous.
So there is a theory that the Cubans had a major role in this and want to get Canada because the hardliners were pissed at Canada for brokering the negotiations between Cuba and the United States. They happened in Toronto, for the most part, and in Ottawa. And the hardliners, the Castro backers, were pissed off that the younger people were now working with Obama to normalize relations. They didn't want that. They wanted to control this.
So explain this a bit, because during the Obama period, he wanted to try and create some sort of a normalization of relations with Cuba, unlike his predecessors and the Republicans.
Yes.
And Canada was on board for that because we have much better relations.
Yeah.
And they got pissed at Canada for brokering that?
Yeah. Yeah. That's one theory why the Canadians were targeted in this.
So our own Canadian officials were targeted with a fairly, sophisticated form of attack.
Yeah.
I think it's
sophisticated.
not insignificant.
It's something that has been described by experts that this kind of weapon has been known about for the last decade. That this was the new form of warfare, and that it could be maintained in a very small, movable device, and it could be very focused. One thing that I've heard recently is that it's surprising that nowhere in the intelligence world has anyone taken credit for it. Because usually on something like this, there will be some communications that there's some credit. People want the credit.
Well,
now,
if you want to keep it a secret.
And one of the Americans who we talked to has said, if you look at Russia, they have gone to extremes of making sure that even though you think it's them, you can't prove it necessarily. They're not leaving a footprint the same way. They interfered with the American election. We think.
Yeah, well, they did.
Right. And so this is just another form of attack to sow problems within certain communities.
This is brilliant work you're doing.
Oh,
brilliant work.
It is fascinating, and so
so
today we have a call.
Great work, Paul. This is so interesting.
So we have a call today with a doctor from who's working with the 26 Americans, and he's a neurobioethicist. I have no idea what that exactly is.
There's ethics in there somewhere.
Yeah, and he
not sure what that is, but
so we're talking to him about one of our biggest concerns in acting for these people is. Okay, you can't identify the exact weapon. If you can identify the weapon, you might.
No, you can't. I mean, it's
so you might be
obscure
able,
in this case.
right? So you might be able to predict what might happen to people. So now it's just a guessing game. And so I asked the doctor. I said, "We have one of our clients has a kid. She's probably 9 or 10 now, and she had some pretty serious cognitive issues after." And
where was she at the time she got hit?
She was in in the living quarters that her mom had. And
in Cuba,
in
Havana.
Yep. Yeah.
And got and her
got-
family got targeted.
Her mother, the mother, and the two kids, and so she was doing better through some really aggressive cognitive rehab. That the mother was taking the kids to the United States, paying out
Because
of
we don't
pocket,
have it here.
because the Canadian government didn't do anything to try and get rehabilitation.
No,
for
we'll
them
leave
here.
that aside. Our healthcare system sucks.
No. I mean, if you wanted to find the right people here, you could do it.
Oh, I don't know about that.
No, you could.
And
At sick kids and some of the, we got great children's hospitals, but they never want
we
to.
do, but accessing our resources.
yeah,
is
but if you're the
ridiculous.
Canadian government, you can do it.
Okay.
Okay, but this kid,
They didn't acknowledge it, so,
Yeah, so
they had to go to the U.S. for private health care.
yep, and the mom has paid out of pocket.
Thank you, Justin.
And the child came down with COVID in April and went downhill cognitively. So I asked the doctor today, I said, could COVID exacerbate? He goes, absolutely. It's an inflammatory response. It's almost having like encephalitis. Like you've got an
Look, you can have
inflammatory-
cognitive responses to it.
Right.
Yeah,
and
100%.
so I said, well, what's the likelihood that it will get better? He goes, it's completely unknown because we don't know the exact device.
Yeah, and the problem now is you have an intersection of a contagion
Right.
with an unknown.
Right. So, so now you're going to have to go to the Canadian government and say, okay, folks, like this 10-year-old kid, the daughter of a lawyer who's a diplomat, high achiever, chances are, though, you sort
Doing
of
her service for Canada.
doing her service and
Doing her service for Canada.
Yeah.
With her family there, with the Canadian government abandoning her.
well, and
Right? Have I got that right? Abandoning
Yep.
her?
The doctor said to us today, he said, I don't understand why Canada has been so hesitant to acknowledge what the rest of the international community is acknowledging.
Oh, I can answer that.
And then we talked about that, and he goes, yeah, probably. That's probably a good reason. And so we asked him,
Where's the United States on this? With their litigation.
they can't sue. They can't sue. There's something called the Fair's Doctrine that the Supreme Court decided back, I believe, in the 50s that says like military and diplomats serving on behalf of the United States cannot sue the government. So a number of senators got together approximately 2 years ago and began working on legislation. And they passed the Havana syndrome legislation that Joe Biden signed into law.
Yeah, I remember that.
Now, unfortunately, and we've...
But is that just for internal compensation versus
Yeah.
international action?
Yeah, it's internal compensation, but it's minimal at best. I mean, I think it's about the most someone can get is about $180,000, which is a pittance when you're talking about people's professional careers that they'll never work again potentially. We've talked, we've had extensive talks with Senator Shaheen's office in the United States, and unfortunately, they just can't share much because it's national security, and which I get. I don't have security clearance, but it's a situation where the Canadian government will come to the table.
They're going to have to.
They have to. And sometimes in politics, you look at the timing of where you are in the middle of a mandate. When do things get settled? Not at the very beginning, and definitely not at the very end.
Somewhere in the middle.
Somewhere in the middle, and that's where we are right now. The non-diplomatic victims, the non-diplomats, we have a mediation set up with a former Supreme Court judge to mediate in May. Now the trick is going to be, okay, let's get the diplomats involved. And I think we'll get there. It just will take a little time.
This is God's work, man.
Yeah, it's fun.
But
It's
you
fun.
know what? You know what?
My wife is scared out of her mind half the time.
Karen, good work for you. But you know what?
She just keeps saying, "Can I meet Ricky Ricardo?" I said, "No, you can't."
No, but this is such a poignant issue because I've always had concerns about overreach of government, all sorts of other issues with government. And here's a different realm for me that you've brought to light. And I want to bring you back to talk more about this in other cases that are similar, where we see our government failing us and failing our diplomats, failing our patriots here, and failing us on the international scale.
So, I know I didn't tell you about this one case, but I'm going to
Talk.
I'm going to dovetail into it.
Bring it on, baby.
We act for 2,500 veterans. In 1992, In 1992, the Canadians sent troops to Somalia.
Yep, I remember that.
And
I'm old enough.
Yeah, and Hoffman LaRoche, a drug company, was working on a drug called mefloquine. It's also known as Lariam, which is an anti-malarial drug.
Oh, yeah.
And I know lots of people that took it because if you traveled to Africa,
Right.
or like
You'd take that drug to prevent.
Yeah, because it was a once-a-week drug.
Yeah.
And there was another drug called doxycycline, which was a daily
It's an
pill.
antibiotic.
Well, it was anti-malarial, and it was a once-a-day pill. So the drug wasn't approved yet when our troops left for Somalia, and the Canadian government got permission to do a clinical trial from Hoffman LaRoche as our troops went off to Somalia. Mm-hmm. Now, unfortunately, the Canadian government didn't follow the clinical protocol, which is a big problem. First of all, number one, it says anyone with pre-existing psychological issues should not take this drug. Anyone who had been in any type of combat before going to Somalia had pre-existing psychological issues. Number one. Number two, it said in the warnings, if you experience these side effects, A, B, C, they list them all out.
Right.
You must discontinue this drug immediately.
And?
They didn't.
Wow.
They just kept feeding them. One of my lead plaintiffs, a guy named John Dow, was in Somalia the night the kid was killed, where the Canadians grabbed him, tortured him. And they were all on mefloquine that night. Mefloquine became known, depending on the day you took it. If you took it on Wednesday, it was known as Wacky Wednesdays. If you took it on Monday, it was Manic Mondays, because of the side effects.
So the impact was, so the cognitive fallout from that was?
It made people
psychotic,
to the point that, and this drug was used from 1992 to 2016.
When they say alcohol's bad.
And we've got 2,500 vets who have taken this drug, and they are not acknowledged as having a.
And you're fighting for them.
So we have 2,500 veterans as our clients. We cut it off because at some point you got to cut off, and we had been all over for 3 years. I went across the country doing town hall meetings. I mean, growing up, I remember.
Dude, you got a lot of energy, my friend.
I remember saying to these guys, I'm in a hall of like 250 veterans, military guys. And I'm like, this is what I said. As I stand here today, I can tell you, I do not have what it takes to do what you guys did. There's no way. What I was told, what people in Afghanistan went through, there's no fucking way. Rwanda, General Dallaire is one of our clients.
Well, he'll tell you about what happened, yeah.
And we met with him, and gentleman through and through, and
a consummate soldier.
Yes, and he was told. I
have mad respect for that.
So he was actually told. He said, "You got to get me off of this. I'm going fucking nuts."
Yeah.
So Dallaire was told, if you don't take the pill, you will be court-martialed. If a general is told that, what's the fucking private supposed to do? And as my wife does point out, this became dollars and cents. One pill a week was 21 cents. Doxycycline was 16 cents a day. Do the math. Now the Canadian government and the military will say
until it adds up for the pharmaceutical companies.
Right. No, it was just easy to administer. You only had to make sure they took it once a week.
What's the end game?
The end game was just they thought this was going to work, and they just turned a blind eye. And you talk about people that put their lives on the line. And so and COVID then, and I do some work with some folks that help vets, and I'm at their office, and they've got a bunch of veterans there, and this is right in the middle of COVID. And we start talking about the vaccine, all right? And I say, listen, I don't need to get into a debate with you.
Yeah, don't, because we'll get canceled off of YouTube.
But what I said to him is, I totally understand your
hesitant.
skepticism.
Yeah.
Because you were lied to about a pill. and look what it did to you. So you're very different than the average citizen. And what he said was, yeah, you're right. But it just bothers me that, I mean, what I learned about going from town to town, like we went to Edmonton, we went to Oromocto, New Brunswick.
Oh my God, my wife Marcy is from Fredericton, New Brunswick, and she knows where Oromocto is.
Okay, there's not a lot to do in Oromocto.
There's gotta be, there has to be a billiard hall.
But when I got there, after being in Edmonton and being other places, I realized they're taking advantage. They're recruiting people whose options are the oil fields, the farms, or the forestry industry. Mm-hmm. They're not getting the upper...
No.
Right? And so these guys, and they're trained to follow orders. You don't question. You never question. And they took advantage of them. And talk about a breach of fiduciary duty.
Explain what that means.
Well, basically...
Please.
Basically, you're talking about people who have power basically controlling you and saying you have no choice. You're going to follow what I say.
Yeah, but a fiduciary duty is you have a duty of care to these people.
You do.
Right?
Yeah.
And they abuse it.
They totally abused it. And I got so much time for these people because I have... Like, I would tear up in these meetings.
Yeah, it's horrible.
And and some of the best work I've ever done was on a Saturday night. I don't know if you remember.
Karen, I bet that sucked for you, but...
No, it was Saturday. We were at home like a typical Saturday night because we're too tired to go out. And
sorry we're old.
I got an email from a client. Her husband was in the hospital. They were both vets, and they were both bodybuilders. And I remember this guy like yesterday. Big guy. He was in the Invictus Games a couple times, and he was dying. Steroid use over the years, his body was breaking down. It was during COVID, and they wouldn't let her into the hospital. He was in palliative care. And so I made it my mission that Saturday night, to get her into the hospital. And we got it. We got it done.
Wow.
We got it done.
Good for you.
And the other one was, if you go on Facebook and type in Mike Rude, Mike and his dog Spark.
Spell Rude.
Rude. I love Mike. And his dog Spark, his service dog. I'm on Facebook. It's a Sunday, and I can remember it like yesterday. I was probably watching football. It's Sunday, and I see Mike's being arrested in BC because he wouldn't leave the Esso gas station because they wouldn't allow dogs. And problem is that it could have been easily dealt with if he would just have left, right? Yeah. But he's belligerent, and he served his country.
He did his time.
And he was right.
Right.
And
he stood his ground.
And so
on principle.
I talked to the cops on the phone. We got everything straightened out. And then I got on I remember I was in Vancouver a few days later, and I'm on the phone with Esso. You f***ers, like, you got to make this right. I said, this guy's going across the country talking about mefloquine, getting clients, getting vets to be in this. And I can't remember what they did something for him. But it was like, those are the best things I've ever done. Because those people did things that I couldn't even fathom. I mean, as I said in one of these meetings, my mother still doesn't let me play on the street. You think I'm going to Afghanistan?
Yeah.
It's like...
Look, we owe it to those people who are heroes of our country.
Yeah.
Who've done these things, and we are but the lawyers who defend people or advocate for them in litigation, and they've done the hard work.
And can I tell you what I've learned? I now say thank you for your service in a very different way.
I have always said that,
I always have, but I do. Like, I was in Washington back in the fall, and I was just walking around the Vietnam Memorial, and you know who's the vets there.
Yeah.
And I went up to a couple of them and I said, thank you for your service. And you say it now, I say it now in a way probably very differently, at least I think I do, because of what I know what these guys
more
do.
emotion.
Yeah, it's like, and it's funny, like, they were told if you don't take mefloquine, if you don't take the pill, you don't go on tour. I'm like, I wouldn't take the pill. And every vet said to me, no, I have trained. This is what I am trained to do. And I'm thinking, you're putting your life on the line. I can't. Well, cheers to them because
cheers to them
because
cheers to the service of our forces and the U.S. forces and what it is about government overreach.
I think I could use a drink.
Okay, it. You're coming back. We're going to talk more about it. Paul Miller,
Cheers.
love you. You're doing God's work.